pushed me off the balcony, and I screamed because I said one sentence he did not want heard. "You are acting foolish," I said, standing beside him on his college floor, and the girl behind him heard it. He turned to me and said, "Why would you say that here?" I told him college was not a place for disrespect. Students passed us. The girl stayed. He said, "Stop." I said he embarrassed himself. He said, "You embarrassed me." Then his hand moved and I fell. The railing disappeared and the ground rushed up. My name is Janet. I am 60 years old. I survived the fall. Greetings, my dear friends. Before I share this heartwarming story with you, I want to ask for a small favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. And drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It would warm my heart to know how far my voice has traveled. Get comfortable. Happy listening. My son asked me to visit his college because he wanted me to see his life, and I believed my presence still mattered. I stood beside him that day thinking I was guiding him, not knowing he had already created a version of himself where my voice was a problem. The girl behind him was someone he cared about, someone he had shown a cleaner story, and my words cracked that image when I woke up below with people gathered and voices calling for help. Someone said it was an accident. Someone said I slipped. And later in the hospital, they asked how I fell. But my son never came, never called. And as I lay there unable to move, I understood the fall was not sudden to him. It was the result of a decision made the moment I spoke. And the reason behind it was still waiting to be said. I woke up in a hospital room with white lights above me and weight in every limb. And the first thing I noticed was the quiet, because no one was holding my hand and no familiar voice was saying my name. Nurse told me I had survived the fall and that my bones were broken, but my head was clear, and I nodded because speaking felt heavier than pain. Hours passed, then a night, then another morning. My son did not come. No call, no message. Visitors came in pairs and left in silence. And every time the door opened, I waited for footsteps I already knew would not arrive. A police officer came with a clipboard and asked how I fell, and I said I was pushed, and he paused before writing anything down, then asked who did it, and I said my son, and the room changed after that. Not loud, not dramatic, just careful. Asked where it happened. I said his college. He asked why. I said because I spoke. He stopped asking questions. Later, a doctor explained the surgery I would need and the months it would take to stand again, and I listened without interrupting because my body could heal, but something else had already been broken, and no one in the room knew how to name it. I replayed the moment over and over, not the fall, but the sentence that came before it, wondering how a mother's voice became a threat, how guidance turned into humiliation, and how quickly a son chose silence over blood. A woman from the college administration visited and said they were looking into the incident, and I asked if my son had said anything, and she said he claimed it was an accident, and the word settled in my chest like something false but convenient. That night, alone again, I stared at the ceiling and realized the truth was already being shaped without me, shaped by distance, by absence, by the fact that the one person who could speak had chosen not to. And as machines hummed beside my bed, I understood that surviving the fall meant I would now have to survive what came next. Because the reason my son pushed me was no longer just mine to uncover. It was becoming a story others would decide for him. They discharged me into silence, not the quiet of peace, but the kind that follows when questions are left unanswered. And I was taken to a small room arranged for recovery, where every movement reminded me of how far I had fallen. Days passed marked by medicine schedules, and short visits from people who spoke carefully, as if the truth might break something else if said too plainly. My son's name was not mentioned unless I said it first, and when I did, eyes shifted and conversations ended. Detective returned and asked if I wanted to press charges, and I said I wanted to understand, because my body already carried the proof, and my heart still needed the reason. He told me my son repeated the same statement each time, that I slipped, that he tried to grab me. That panic confused the moment, and I listened, because every version erased my voice from the scene. I asked if anyone else was there. He said a student was nearby, but refused to speak. The girl, the one who heard everything. College officials sent a letter filled with concern and process, and nowhere in it was there a question about me as a mother. I called my son's phone for the first time since the fall, and it went unanswered. And the silence after the call ended felt louder than the impact ever did. I began to see how quickly the story had moved past me, how easily my survival became an inconvenience, how my presence complicated the clean version he needed to keep. At night, I stared at the window and wondered when guidance became shame, when a warning became an insult worth erasing, and whether the boy I raised understood the weight of what he had done or only the risk of being seen. Each day brought new paperwork and no answers, and with every form signed, I felt the space between mother and son widen into something official, something documented, something that could no longer be undone. And I knew then that the fall was not the end of the damage. It was the beginning of a separation that would test how much truth the world was willing to hold. First time my son finally called, his voice was calm and measured, and he did not ask how I was. He said there were questions being asked at the college, and that I needed to be careful with what I said. I listened without interrupting, because I wanted to hear how he framed the moment now that distance had settled in. He said people misunderstood what happened, that stress made things look worse, that accidents can happen fast. And I told him I remembered his hand on me. He went silent and then said I was exaggerating, and that my words at the college caused problems for him. I asked him if he understood I could have died, and he said that bringing that up would only damage his future. That sentence stayed with me longer than the pain in my body. I realized then that his fear was not about what he had done, but about who might hear it. After the call ended, I sat still and understood that my son was no longer speaking to me as a mother, but as a risk. Letters from the college continued, focused on review and policy, and none of them asked about the family involved. A counselor suggested mediation, and the words sounded like a negotiation over something that should never have happened. I began to prepare myself for the truth that my role had changed, not because of age or weakness, but because my presence threatened the image he had built. Each movement toward healing required accepting that the bond I trusted was being rewritten without my consent, and that the next step would demand a decision I had avoided, whether to protect the son I raised or to protect the truth I survived. Hospitals smelled of antiseptic and despair, the hum of machines filling the spaces between hushed voices and footsteps that seemed to echo louder than they should. I lay in a bed that felt too large, too cold, my body heavy with pain I could not name, my mind heavier with the thought of what had just happened. The doctors spoke around me, words sharp and clinical, but I could barely focus. My thoughts were stuck on him, my son, the boy I had raised, the one whose laughter used to light rooms now replaced with a shadow I did not recognize. I remembered the moment in college, the careless words that slipped from my mouth, intended to tease, to guide, but landing instead as a public wound, a humiliation he carried like a silent storm. I had never imagined it could twist into violence, that he could see me as a target rather than a mother. Every detail of that push haunted me. The feel of the wind, the screech of metal against skin, the air itself seeming to split in two before I landed, my body screaming in ways my voice could not reach. Yet I survived, my bones bruised, my heart fractured. And with survival came a horror far worse. Understanding the reason, the spark of anger I had lit without realizing how combustible it had become. Nurses passed with gentle touches and soft reassurances, but I could only feel the emptiness inside, the betrayal and confusion twisting together until they were indistinguishable. Outside, life went on. People moved, the city unaware of the collision of love and fear happening in this room, unaware of the fragility of trust, how quickly it could shatter under weightless pressure and misplaced pride. I tried to speak to him later, words caught in my throat, the image of that moment replaying endlessly, questions lodged in my chest. He avoided me, his silence sharper than any accusation, and in that silence, I felt a new kind of death, the death of certainty, of the belief that a mother's love could shield her from everything, even her own mistakes. The hours stretched, a slow, relentless current, and I realized that healing would not come from medicine alone, but from navigating the fracture he had created, from understanding how a single moment of shame could transform a child into someone unrecognizable, and how I, a mother, had to survive the consequences of words spoken carelessly. Even as my own body healed, hospital room was quiet again, the machines ticking methodically, and in that quiet, I sensed the first true weight of the choice I now faced: how to confront him, how to face the shadow of a son who had turned rage into action, and how to rebuild what was left from the fragments of that fall. The first night at home after the hospital was the hardest. Every creak of the floor, every shadow cast by the streetlights felt amplified, as if the house itself remembered what had happened and whispered warnings I could not ignore. I moved slowly, testing each step, feeling the bruises in my body flare with every motion, the ache in my ribs, a constant reminder of the force that had hurled me from the balcony. He didn't speak, didn't enter the room, and I watched from the corner as he sat at the edge of his bed, his shoulders rigid, hands fidgeting with the edge of the blanket, his silence heavy enough to fill the entire house. I thought about the college incident over and over, the words I had thrown carelessly in front of his crush, laughing without realizing the wound I had carved in his pride. And now I understood the depth of that wound, how a moment of embarrassment could spiral into something irreparable. I tried to reach him with small gestures, leaving water on the nightstand, soft words in the kitchen. But he recoiled from everything, the distance between us unbridgeable in that instant, his eyes turning away when mine sought connection. Dinner was a quiet affair, the clatter of dishes the only sound, each bite feeling tasteless, swallowed with the weight of unsaid apologies and unasked questions. Memories of his childhood, the way he had once climbed onto my lap, the way his laughter had filled the corners of this same house, haunted me as I realized those moments were irretrievably replaced by suspicion and resentment. I wondered if he even remembered the push the same way I did, or if in his mind it had already been justified, rewritten into a narrative where I was the offender and he the victim. The night stretched long and merciless, and sleep offered no relief. Every time I closed my eyes, the fall, the scream, the shock of realization replayed like a relentless echo in my mind. I understood then that surviving was not enough, that I had to navigate not only my pain, but the fracture between us, the anger that had festered unnoticed until it erupted into violence. I traced the lines of my body in the mirror, noting the black and blue map of survival, and wondered if he saw me the same way, broken but still standing, human but no longer invulnerable. House settled into silence as I sat alone, thinking, planning, questioning, and the reality pressed down with unrelenting gravity. No amount of love could undo the past, and no words could guarantee that the future would be any gentler. I realized the first step was understanding, not blame, and that to move forward, I would need to face him directly, confront the shadow of what had been done, and find a way to reach a son who had chosen pain over forgiveness, even if the path to that moment would be fraught with more fear than I had ever known. Morning sunlight spilled weakly through the curtains, but it brought no warmth, only a reminder that the world outside continued, as if nothing had happened while inside. The air was thick with tension and unspoken dread. He stayed in his room, door half closed, the faint sound of his music filtering through, notes sharp and cold against the quiet I tried to maintain. I moved carefully through the house, each step deliberate, conscious of the space between us, aware that even the smallest noise could trigger something unanticipated. Breakfast was left on the counter. I didn't dare enter the room. I watched him from the doorway of the kitchen, the way his hand rested on the edge of the table, knuckles white, his movements precise, controlled, like he was measuring every breath, every heartbeat. I remembered the words I had thrown at him months ago, meant as teasing, but landing like stones thrown at fragile glass. And the thought of them now felt like poison, something that had seeped slowly until it reached a point beyond repair. My own stomach churned with guilt and fear. I wanted to reach him, to apologize, to explain. But each attempt was met with silence, a wall I could not penetrate. The phone rang, a neighbor calling to check in, and I smiled faintly, masking the turmoil within, hiding bruises beneath long sleeves, pretending to the world that I was fine, while the house groaned with memories of violence and betrayal. The living room, once filled with laughter and easy conversation, now felt like a courtroom where judgment had already been passed, and I was both accused and witness, powerless to shift the balance. I thought about his future, the college humiliation, the crush, and how that one moment had shifted something fundamental between us, turning familiarity into fear, love into caution. Hours passed slowly, each tick of the clock emphasizing the distance between us, the silence that had grown heavy enough to press against my chest. I moved to his room finally, just outside the door, listening to his breathing, waiting for a crack, a hint of softness, a moment where he would let me in again. But the space remained impenetrable, his walls as solid as stone. In that moment, I realized the push from the balcony was only the beginning, a violent punctuation in a story that had been written long before. And that to survive this, I would need patience, strategy, and courage I had never called on before. House felt smaller, the air tighter, as if every room remembered and whispered, and I knew the next step had to be mine to confront, to understand, to survive not just physically, but emotionally, in a way that might finally bridge the abyss he had created between us, a chasm that seemed endless, but was mine to navigate. Evening came with a weight that pressed against the walls, shadows stretching long and cold across the floor as I prepared dinner alone, the clatter of utensils sharp against the silence, each sound announcing my presence to a house that felt foreign. He did not appear, did not ask for food, and I resisted the urge to knock, to demand, to plead, knowing that any breach might ignite the anger that had already taken physical form once. Memories of the balcony replayed relentlessly in my mind. The instant of the push, the rush of air, the scream, the impact, and the hollow realization that my body survived while my trust shattered. I traced that memory carefully, examining every word I had spoken in college, the laughter, the teasing, the inadvertent shame I had caused, and felt the sting of accountability that went beyond my own bruises. I moved through the kitchen with deliberate calm, placing plates on the counter, arranging everything in a way that spoke of normalcy, though I knew it was fragile, temporary. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, carrying the faint sounds of life, unaware that inside, a mother and son navigated the aftermath of violence. Silence stretched into a tangible, suffocating presence. I thought about his room, the door closed, the space between us wider than any conversation could bridge, and realized that reaching him would require more than words. It would require patience, observation, a careful reading of the cues he allowed. The sound of his footsteps finally approached, slow, measured, hesitant, and I held my breath, bracing for a glance that could either break the tension or solidify it further. He paused at the edge of the kitchen, studying the table, my hands, the ordinary arrangement of food, as if measuring whether I had changed, whether the weight of fear had softened, whether any part of me acknowledged the fracture he had created. I kept my face neutral, my body still, letting the space between us speak its own language, one of restrained fear and unspoken questions. Hours passed in this tense equilibrium, each movement a test, each silence an accusation, each glance a small negotiation of trust. I realized then that survival meant more than healing the body. It meant understanding the mind, anticipating the next move, finding a path through anger and resentment that neither of us fully understood yet. Night fell, the house dark except for a single lamp casting a circle of light where I sat, thinking, planning, observing, knowing that the fall from the balcony had been only the beginning, and that the real challenge was not just to survive, but to restore a fragile connection to a son whose actions had left scars far deeper than flesh could show. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting lines across the living room floor, and I moved quietly, careful not to disturb the fragile tension that had settled over the house. He did not appear at breakfast, his absence a loud statement, a wall built higher than any door could hold. I sat at the table, tracing the edge of the cup in my hands, feeling the ache in my ribs, and shoulders pulse with each shallow breath, remembering the balcony, the push, the instant of betrayal that had rewired everything I thought I knew about him. Thoughts of college swirled relentlessly. The words I had thrown thoughtlessly, meant to tease, to guide, now replayed as a catalyst for the violence I could not undo. I considered every interaction since then, the small gestures, the ignored glances, the moments I had tried to bridge the gap, and realized that none of it had reached him, that the silence was now a language of its own, unyielding and precise. I moved through the house deliberately, noting the faint marks on the wall where he had leaned, the scattered belongings on the floor, the subtle absence of warmth in spaces he used to fill with laughter. I wondered if he remembered that night the same way I did, or if his mind had already rationalized it, rewriting the story into a version where his anger was justified and my survival meaningless. The hours passed slowly, each tick of the clock echoing the distance between us, and I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my chest, not for the fall alone, but for the words that had sparked it, the unmeasured carelessness that had ignited a chain reaction. I wanted to speak to him, to ask, to understand, to find a way back, but he remained inaccessible, a storm contained in a room, and I knew any attempt could tip the balance, ignite the fury I had barely escaped before. Evening came with long shadows stretching across the walls, the house quiet except for the occasional rustle of sheets, and I realized the true challenge lay not in my recovery, but in navigating the fractured trust. in finding a way to reach a son who had turned fear into control, anger into armor, and whose eyes no longer sought mine. I sat in the living room as night fell, thinking, planning, watching, knowing that healing was not linear, that patience would be tested, that understanding him required more than explanations, more than apologies. It demanded a careful, measured approach, strategy rooted in observation and empathy, and a willingness to face a reality where the child I had raised had become a force I could neither predict nor contain, where every choice I made could shape the path toward reconciliation or deepen the fracture beyond repair. Night had fallen completely, and the house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling walls. But the stillness brought no comfort, only a reminder of the invisible distance between us. I moved from room to room, carefully avoiding his door, knowing that any intrusion could trigger the anger he still carried, a force I had already seen turn violent once. My body ached in ways the hospital had treated but not erased, ribs still tender, arms sore, and the memory of the balcony hit like a jolt every time I shifted too quickly. I thought of the college moment again, the careless words, the laughter at someone else's expense, and I traced how that single misstep had spiraled into a night of terror, into a son who had chosen to act rather than speak. I watched him from the corner of the hall as he moved silently, methodically, through the space, the rhythm of his steps deliberate, almost mechanical, like he was measuring every inch, every breath, every second that passed. Dinner had been ignored, dishes untouched, and I realized that feeding him or calling him down would have felt like an intrusion, an assumption that he still shared any sense of normalcy with me. I tried to summon the courage to speak, to reach across the divide, but words faltered in my throat, my own guilt heavy with the knowledge of what I had set in motion. Every memory of his childhood, the hands I held, the laughter I coaxed, the tears I wiped felt fragile, like they existed in a different life, a life before shame had twisted into anger. The evening stretched on, the shadows thickening as I sat alone in the living room, mind racing with strategies, possibilities, and fears. I realized that moving forward would require patience far beyond my previous experience, a careful balance between presence and distance, observation and action, and a willingness to face a son who had crossed a line I had never imagined, whose gaze I could not predict, whose reactions could swing from silence to fury in an instant. I thought of the trust that had been broken, of the bond I had assumed was unshakable, and understood that survival was no longer enough. Rebuilding, if possible, demanded navigating not only the fear he projected, but also the shame he carried, a complex weight that I would have to untangle carefully, step by cautious step. Outside, the night remained indifferent, unaware of the storm contained within walls that once offered comfort, and I sat, planning, waiting, knowing that the next encounter could redefine everything, that the smallest misstep might undo progress, and that patience, clarity, and strategy would be my only allies in the days to come. The next morning, sunlight fell weakly through the blinds, painting thin lines across the floor, but it brought no warmth, only a stark reminder of the silence that had settled between us, heavy and unyielding. He stayed in his room, door closed, and I moved through the house with caution, aware that any misstep could ignite anger, that my presence alone could be a provocation. I set the table for breakfast, leaving dishes carefully arranged, but they remained untouched. Even the smell of food could not coax him out, could not bridge the chasm that had formed overnight, or perhaps over months. My mind replayed the incident in college, the careless words I had spoken, meant as teasing, now a seed of humiliation that had grown into this act of violence, this breach of trust, this silent rebellion that left me watching a stranger in my son's body. I checked the bruises in the mirror, each one a stark reminder of the force I had survived and the fragility of the bond we once shared. Outside, life carried on, indifferent, unaware that a mother and her son were negotiating the aftermath of betrayal in a quiet house, that every glance, every movement, every sigh could tip the balance further. I debated whether to confront him, to speak, to ask, to apologize, but hesitated, knowing that words could ignite more than heal, that patience and observation were my only tools for now. Hours stretched, each tick of the clock emphasizing the weight of distance, the intensity of unspoken thoughts, the enormity of repairing what had been fractured. I thought of his childhood, of hands I had held, laughter I had coaxed, lessons I had taught, now overshadowed by this act, and felt the deep ache of a connection that had been taken for granted. House seemed smaller, the air tighter, each room holding memories and tension, a landscape of trust shattered into fragments that needed careful navigation. When he finally appeared in the hallway, he paused, measuring, watching, the weight of what had passed between us visible in every step, every gesture. I held myself still, letting him set the pace, absorbing the tension, knowing that the path to reconciliation, if possible, required not force, not pleading, but careful understanding, a delicate strategy, and unwavering patience. The day passed slowly, a test of endurance, of restraint, of the ability to survive emotionally as well as physically. And I realized that healing would demand more than forgiveness, more than explanation. It would demand insight into the anger, fear, and humiliation that had led him to cross a line I had never imagined, and that every choice I made in the hours to come could determine whether the bond between mother and son could be restored or remain irreparably broken. Afternoon dragged on with a quiet heaviness that settled into every corner of the house, sunlight slanting through the blinds and creating sharp patterns across the floor, each line a reminder of the distance between us. I moved carefully, tending to small chores, each motion deliberate, my body still tender from the fall, ribs aching, muscles stiff. Yet every movement felt necessary to reclaim a sense of normalcy that seemed to evade me. He remained in his room, the door slightly ajar, and I caught glimpses of him from across the hall, the way he sat motionless, absorbed in something beyond my reach, a presence that commanded the space without speaking. I recalled the words I had spoken in college, the teasing that had seemed harmless at the time, now understood as a turning point, a moment that had planted a seed of resentment I had never recognized until it erupted into violence. I prepared food, carefully arranged it, left a note, but he did not respond, his absence in the kitchen as clear as the bruises that lined my side. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying faint sounds of neighbors, life moving forward, yet inside, time seemed to stall, measured in pauses, glances, and unspoken calculations. I considered approaching him, opening a door that had been closed too long, but hesitated, knowing that my actions now required precision, that trust could not be demanded, only earned, and that each step needed awareness of his boundaries, his current state, the fragile balance of control he now exerted over the household. I traced the lines of his room, the small signs of presence, books stacked unevenly, the faint hum of a phone, the tilt of a chair, and understood that he was signaling without words, asserting distance, testing the parameters of connection, and I could only observe, plan, and respond with patience. Evening descended, shadows lengthened, and I remained alert to subtle shifts in movement, listening for changes in rhythm, tone, presence, and absence. I reflected on the fall, on the collision of words and actions, the transformation of a child I had raised into someone I barely recognized, and realized that the path forward required more than healing, demanded strategy, insight, and restraint, a careful navigation of fear, anger, and pride, an understanding that survival had been the first step, but that rebuilding the bond demanded measured, deliberate steps. Night finally settled over the house, and I sat quietly in the living room, preparing for the confrontation that was inevitable, knowing that patience, observation, and timing would determine whether we could find a way back from the fracture he had caused, and whether the trust I had once assumed eternal could be restored without further damage. The weight of this responsibility pressing down as the quiet night held its own silent judgment over everything that had occurred. The next morning felt unusually still, the sunlight cutting through the blinds in thin, precise lines, and I moved through the house carefully, each step measured, mindful of the tension that hung in every room. He remained in his room, the door closed more firmly than usual, a barrier that both protected and isolated him, and I felt the weight of that choice pressing against the quiet. I went about daily routines, arranging items, folding clothes, preparing breakfast, leaving them untouched. Yet I observed every subtle movement he made, the faint shuffle of his feet, the shift of his gaze, the minimal gestures that betrayed focus and intent. The memory of the college incident lingered, not as shame repeated, but as a reference point, a cause that had shaped the consequences I now faced. And I contemplated how a single moment of public embarrassment had morphed into calculated distance and unspoken retaliation. I tried to predict his patterns, anticipating where he might appear, how he might respond, and how to navigate the house without provoking any reaction I could not control. Bruises on my side ached with every minor motion, a constant physical reminder of what had transpired. And I counted the cost, not only in body, but in the fracture of our relationship, the precise calibration of caution required for every interaction. Inside, the city moved in ignorance, unaware that inside these walls, every gesture, glance, and silence carried significance, shaping the possibilities for reconciliation or further conflict. Hours passed with slow precision, my movements deliberate, observing, waiting, testing boundaries, never forcing, never pressing, aware that each choice had consequences. Evening drew long shadows, stretching across floors and walls, and I felt the subtle changes in sound, light, and presence, noting how the atmosphere shifted with his slightest motion, and how the balance of control oscillated in ways I could not yet influence. I realized that to reach him, I needed strategy rooted in observation, patience, and careful timing. I could not demand trust, only create conditions where he might cautiously allow it to exist again. I'd settled finally, the quiet punctuated only by faint mechanical hums, and I understood that the fracture between us required more than apologies or explanations. It demanded an intricate navigation of power, restraint, and insight, a careful orchestration of actions and inactions designed to protect, to rebuild, and to ensure that the son who had once acted in fury might eventually confront his own choices, and that I could survive emotionally, physically, and strategically while walking the narrow path between confrontation and reconciliation, in a house that now held the echoes of a fall that changed everything between us. The morning light was muted, filtered through heavy clouds that made the house feel colder, smaller, as if the walls themselves held memory of the fall, and every step carried unspoken tension. I moved quietly through the rooms, attending to small tasks, arranging the space as if creating order could tame the chaos. but every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a potential warning. He stayed in his room, the door barely cracked, and I observed from a distance, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the slight tilt of his head, the way his hands rested on his lap, controlled, restrained, waiting, as if measuring whether I had changed, whether the weight of what had happened registered in ways I could not see. I recalled that moment at college, the careless words, the public embarrassment I had never intended to wound, the laughter that now felt like a betrayal of foresight, a spark that had ignited something far beyond my understanding. I prepared meals, placed them neatly on the counter, left a note, but he did not respond. The space between us thick with unspoken calculations, the tension vibrating in the air like a low hum. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying sounds of life and routine, indifferent to the fracture within, and I realized that the physical recovery I had survived was trivial compared to the landscape of caution, strategy, and awareness I now had to navigate. Each glance, each step, each measured movement mattered. A wrong word or gesture could tip the balance, ignite old anger, or deepen distance that had already grown into a chasm. I considered approaching him, but restraint demanded observation, patience, and a careful reading of the cues he allowed, the unspoken rules of interaction that had formed in the wake of his action. Hours stretched with deliberate slowness, and I traced the contours of the house, the traces of his presence, the subtle signals of mood, control, and boundaries, understanding that rebuilding trust required a methodical approach, awareness, and timing beyond instinct. Night fell, shadows pressing along the walls, and I sat in the living room, planning, analyzing, and bracing for the confrontation that would inevitably come, knowing that survival was only the first step, that the real challenge was to navigate the space between us, to reach a son whose actions had shattered assumptions, altered dynamics, and forced me into a world where patience, insight, and calculated empathy were the only tools that might restore a bond that had already been fractured beyond simple recognition. The day passed slowly, sunlight slipping through the blinds at sharp angles, highlighting the small imperfections in the walls, the dust, the traces of movement, each detail amplifying the tension that hung in the air like a physical weight. I moved through the house with deliberate care, attending to mundane tasks, folding clothes, wiping surfaces, the rhythm of my actions measured and precise. Yet every motion carried the awareness of him nearby, behind closed doors, observing without speaking. He remained in his room, door slightly ajar, and I noticed the subtle signs of his presence, the soft shuffle of feet, the quiet click of a device, a chair slightly shifted, signals that mapped his mood without words. I revisited the memory of that college moment repeatedly. The careless words I had spoken, meant as teasing, now understood as the pivot point of everything that had followed. The humiliation that had fueled a calculated, deliberate act of violence. The fracture of trust that left the house suffused with caution. I prepared a meal, left it on the counter, and stepped back, watching the doorway. Yet he did not respond. The distance between us, as deliberate as the push from the balcony, as measured as every second that passed. Outside, the world continued oblivious, cars passing, neighbors moving about their lives, unaware that inside, every gesture, glance, and pause carried consequences, shaping the fragile balance between fear and connection, control and reconciliation. I reflected on how a single moment of public shame could ripple into something far larger than intention, transforming familiar bonds into landscapes of observation, strategy, and careful restraint. And I realized that the first step toward repair required more than words. It required timing, awareness, and patience calibrated to his current state. Evening settled slowly, shadows stretching across the floor, and I monitored every sound, every flicker of movement, noting how he navigated space, measured my presence, gauged intent. I recognized that the push was not just an act of anger, but a message, an assertion of control, and that responding recklessly could unravel progress or provoke repetition. I deepened, the house silent except for faint mechanical hums, and I remained vigilant, planning for the next interaction, analyzing signals, and preparing mentally for the confrontation I knew was inevitable, understanding that survival had been only the beginning, and the true challenge lay in navigating the fractured bond, reading the subtle cues of a son who had transformed anger into action, and discovering whether reconciliation was possible or whether the gap he had created was one I would have to learn to live with while maintaining both caution and resolve. Morning brought a gray, heavy light that settled across the house, casting muted shadows along the walls and floors, and I moved carefully, each step measured, conscious of the way. The air felt charged with his absence and presence. At the same time, he remained in his room, door closed, and I noted the subtle changes, the faint creak of a floorboard, the shift of a curtain, the distant click of a device. Each sound a reminder that he was aware, alert, monitoring. Even without words, I went about simple tasks, arranging dishes, straightening furniture, the rhythm of activity designed to maintain calm. But every gesture carried the weight of observation, every pause a test of patience. My mind returned again to that college moment, the careless words I had spoken, the embarrassment that had seemed fleeting at the time, now revealed as a turning point, a seed of resentment that had grown into a violent act, a push that changed everything between us. I considered the house itself, the way rooms felt different, charged with anticipation, every corner holding traces of his presence, every hallway echoing the memory of what had occurred, and realized that survival meant understanding this new landscape, the unspoken rules that governed our interactions, the boundaries now established through action rather than conversation. Outside, the wind carried ordinary sounds, dogs barking, cars passing, distant voices. Yet inside, time stretched, measured by glances, motions, and silences. A clock ticking in rhythm with tension rather than hours. I reflected on the physical marks I carried, ribs tender, limbs stiff, the scars visible yet dwarfed by the invisible weight of the broken connection. The fracture that demanded strategy, careful observation, and calculated action. Afternoon passed with minimal movement, each gesture deliberate, each approach tentative, each glance measured. And I realized that he was testing, assessing, and asserting control over space and mood. And any misstep could provoke escalation or push him further away. Night fell slowly, shadows deepening, and I sat in quiet observation, planning the next careful step, understanding that healing required more than apologies, more than words, more than immediate gestures. It required timing, insight, and patience. I knew that the challenge ahead was not simply to survive, but to navigate a complex web of silence, restraint, and subtle communication, to read a son transformed by anger, and to prepare for the confrontation that would inevitably come, confrontation that could either begin the process of reconciliation or solidify the divide forever, leaving the house forever haunted by a moment that had started with a single careless word and ended with a push that altered the trajectory of our lives irreversibly. House was quieter than usual, the faint hum of distant traffic barely penetrating the walls, and I moved slowly through the rooms, aware of the fragile equilibrium that had formed, each step calculated, each breath measured. knowing that one wrong motion could ripple through the tension like a shockwave. He remained in his room, the door ajar just enough to catch movement, and I watched from a distance as he adjusted items on his desk. The careful precision of his actions, a reminder that he was still in control, still measuring, still asserting his presence without speaking. I thought about the college incident in a way that was factual rather than emotional, retracing the moment when my words had caused a ripple. The laughter and teasing that had seemed harmless now recognized as a catalyst, a hinge point that had shifted the balance of our relationship, turning a son I knew into someone capable of calculated aggression. I prepared small tasks, setting out food, tidying spaces, moving deliberately to avoid confrontation, and observed the subtle changes in his posture, his hands, the way he shifted weight, noting every nonverbal signal, every minute detail that could indicate willingness or resistance. Outside, wind and light moved through the trees, indifferent to the tension contained within walls, and I realized that the physical recovery I endured was secondary to the mental and strategic effort required to navigate the chasm that now separated us. Hours passed with careful observation, tracking patterns, noting reactions to ordinary stimuli, understanding that the smallest misstep might provoke another act, another assertion of control, and that patience, timing, and precision were the only tools to manage this fragile dynamic. I descended, shadows stretching long across the rooms, and I considered the balance of space, silence, and cautious gestures, knowing that every interaction, however minor, had consequences, that rebuilding any measure of trust required meticulous attention and calculated engagement. I understood that the fall from the balcony was only the beginning of a larger, more complex challenge, one that demanded insight into his behavior, recognition of the power he wielded silently, and the ability to act without provoking escalation, creating a path forward that combined survival, observation, and strategic patience. Quiet persisted, thick and tangible, and I prepared myself mentally for the inevitable confrontation, aware that the choices I made in the coming hours would determine whether the bond could begin to heal, or whether the fracture would become permanent, leaving the house haunted by a single, irreversible moment that had altered the trajectory of our lives in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. The house was dim in the late afternoon, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls, and I moved quietly, each step deliberate, every gesture measured, knowing that even minor actions carried significance in the tension-filled space. He remained in his room, door slightly ajar, absorbed in tasks that seemed methodical, almost ritualistic. His presence felt more in the absence of sound than in movement, a silent assertion of control that I had learned to read carefully. I tended to small chores, placing items precisely, preparing meals with attention to order and timing, leaving them untouched, understanding that forcing interaction could trigger resistance or provoke a response I could not contain. My thoughts returned to the college incident, the words I had spoken publicly, the embarrassment I had caused, considered now in a detached sequence of cause and effect, a clear explanation for the push without sentiment, a trigger that led to this delicate, ongoing standoff. I observed subtle details, the way his hand hovered over objects, the shift in posture when light touched the desk, the quiet hum of devices, each movement cataloged, a map of his current state and the boundaries he had silently established. Outside, the wind rustled trees, birds called in the distance, indifferent to the gravity contained within walls that had once been familiar and safe. And I understood that my recovery extended beyond physical healing, required constant vigilance, planning, and anticipation of his actions. Hours passed with minimal interaction, each moment a silent negotiation, and I recognized that rebuilding the bond would demand strategic patience, the ability to respond without provocation, and the careful timing of engagement, balancing presence with restraint, proximity with distance. I drew in, the house quiet except for faint mechanical sounds, and I contemplated the trajectory of the day, noting every sign, every microchange, aware that the slightest misjudgment could unravel progress or push him further away. I realized that survival was no longer about enduring physical pain, but navigating psychological terrain, reading cues, predicting behavior, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation that would determine whether reconciliation was possible or whether the divide had become permanent. Shadows deepened across the rooms, and I sat observing, planning, and calculating, understanding that the fracture caused by one impulsive act had transformed the household into a landscape of precision and caution, and that the next interaction required careful orchestration, insight into his intentions, and a patience that would test limits, demanding the highest level of awareness and restraint to preserve what remained of a mother-son connection that had been forever altered. The day moved slowly, the light shifting through the windows, stretching long beams across the floor, and I moved deliberately through the house, attending to tasks that required precision and awareness, each action measured for effect, each pause intentional, knowing that the slightest misstep could provoke reaction. He stayed in his room, door slightly ajar, absorbed in activities that were quiet, precise, controlled, and I observed from a distance, noting the alignment of objects, the angle of light across his desk, subtle gestures that indicated attention and calculation, a silent language that I had learned to interpret over these days. I prepared food, left it arranged neatly, and stepped back, watching the doorway, aware that forcing interaction would yield resistance and potentially escalate tension. The memory of the college incident replayed with stark clarity, not as shame or regret repeated, but as the pivot, the trigger, the sequence of events that had caused this current dynamic. And I traced the causal chain in my mind, considering every small detail of my words and actions, the laughter that had seemed harmless, the embarrassment he had endured, and how it had shifted him into calculated distance and silent assertion of control. Outside, life continued unaware. Neighbors moving, distant sounds of traffic, birds calling, oblivious to the fragile equilibrium inside. And I understood that my recovery was no longer limited to the body. It extended into observation, timing, and strategic engagement, reading cues and understanding intent with care. Hours passed in this careful monitoring, each movement cataloged, each gesture considered, the weight of anticipation pressing without being named, the house holding memory of the fall and its consequences in every shadow and corner. Evening approached, shadows deepening, and I noted shifts in posture, attention, and focus, recording each subtle signal, aware that rebuilding trust required more than words or apologies. It required patience, strategic engagement, and a readiness to navigate responses I could not predict. Night settled finally, the quiet thick, and I planned the next step, calculating timing, approach, and restraint, knowing that the fractured connection demanded careful orchestration, insight into his mindset, vigilance that extended through every interaction, understanding that the push from the balcony had been the beginning of a complex, ongoing challenge, a challenge that required emotional precision, observation, calculated patience to prevent further fracture, and to possibly reclaim some measure of the bond that had been altered irrevocably by a single, impulsive act. Night had fully descended. The house cloaked in darkness, except for a single lamp casting a soft circle of light across the living room. And I moved carefully, aware that tonight required clarity, restraint, and precision. He emerged from his room, silent, measured, and I watched as he paused at the doorway. Noting the alignment of objects around him, the stillness in the air, the tension held in the spaces between steps, I spoke softly, words deliberate, concise, acknowledging the incident without pleading, explaining the unintended consequence of my actions at college, and observing his response closely, noting the slight narrowing of eyes, the subtle shift of shoulders, the brief intake of breath, the micro changes that indicated attention and processing. The silence stretched, heavy but purposeful, as I allowed him space to absorb, to reflect, to confront internally the push, the anger, and the rupture that had transformed our bond. I remained calm, poised, letting the house itself hold the memory, while the present unfolded with intention, recognizing that control, patience, and measured engagement were the only tools to guide us toward understanding. In its past, marked only by small gestures, subtle acknowledgement, and the faint sound of shifting feet, until he finally sat across from me, posture easing slightly, the wall he had erected beginning to show cracks. I observed, responded minimally, providing space for dialogue that was careful, tentative, and authentic, avoiding any pressure, allowing him to articulate without interruption, to navigate his own accountability. Gradually, he spoke, words cautious, hesitant, revealing the embarrassment, the hurt, and the pride that had fueled his action. And I listened, absorbing the confession without judgment, acknowledging the reality without diminishing its impact, letting the conversation build a fragile bridge between us. By the end of the night, a subtle shift had occurred, a recognition of cause and consequence, a tentative connection beginning to form where fear had once dominated. And I understood that this fragile repair required continued patience, observation, and measured engagement. That survival had transitioned into the work of reconciliation. As he returned to his room, the house felt lighter, though the memory of the fall remained, a marker of what had been endured and overcome. My dear friends, if you found this story interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to help stories like this be heard. Thank you for listening, for staying with me through each step of a journey that tested both body and heart, and for witnessing the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust, one measured step at a time.